the start of the season and asked if we live stream, would she be able to get it in Georgia? And I said, well, I think you should be able to. You got internet there. Yeah. And I said, if you don't mind me asking, why or how do you know about Sense of Place? And she said, well, I used to visit the gorge because my grandparents lived there, and I fell in love with the place, and I wanted to keep in touch with the place. Her grandfather died, and I said, well, Gorge is a small town. Who was your grandpa? And she said, Keith McCoy. Does anyone here know Keith McCoy? Yeah. All those people who are mumbling, they probably knew Keith. I never got to meet him, but he was one of the local historians who helped capture the stories of this place in so many different ways. Someone who I wish I could have met. So that was really special. And I think it's a great example of the power of this place, which we're definitely going to see some of tonight after Gifford. What I think is really important about this story is what went on here and continues to go on here rippled throughout the country and rippled throughout the world in many ways. And so it's a very special topic. It's also a very complex topic. If you've been with Sense of Place for very long, you know that we have addressed public forests and public lands in a number of different ways. This is another way we're going to learn and fill in some of that story tonight. If you leave tonight thinking this is a black and white, good, bad, spotted owl versus logger story, and think that it's a simple good versus evil, then I've not done my job. So hopefully tonight you leave with a greater appreciation for the nuance and complexity of this really important part of our history that is actually quite astonishing, the amount of change that has happened in just the past century. I grew up in Oregon, and I was coming of age when parents who were loggers. And Tom McCall was the story my parents told me about. So for me to read Rand's book and hear just what has gone on in our learning curve, the goods, the bads, the uglies, the hopefuls, this is a huge story. And I'm excited to tell you about some old growth in the Sense of Place world. That is our sponsors. Like a good old growth tree. Thanks, guys. Thank you. I know, grown. I am the queen of dad jokes, so bear with me here. Our sponsors loom large in my world. They support us in so many different ways. They support so many different things in our community. You'll see some of them out in the lobby. Columbia Center for the Arts also is part of this. It's a big, rich, lively community that's supported by these people, and Sense of Place is very grateful to the businesses, the fellow nonprofits, and the individuals who support this program. To me, the diversity of that group says so much about our community, and I'm very proud of it. I also want to tell you about Mount Adams Institute. As you may know, Sense of Place is a program of Mount Adams Institute. They are a local nonprofit doing work nationwide. They often partner with the Forest Service, which we'll hear some about tonight. And so to continue my theme of bad jokes or bad metaphors, Sense of Place is like a tree in the Mount Adams Institute forest. You guys are so, I'm sorry. God, I'm so glad my kids couldn't come tonight. It's horrible. So the way things will work is Rand is going to come talk to you about the story of old growth and Gifford Pinchot, and when he's done, we're going to have a chance for Q&A. And great stuff comes out at Q&A. Don't be afraid to ask questions, because a lot of times if you have it, other people have it, so don't be shy. So this topic, for years, as I do with many topics, I have these ones that I just think, sometime I got to figure out how we can learn more about this story. And for years, I've been wanting to learn about who the hell was Gifford Pinchot? I mean, if you're new to the area, you might be wondering, is this a person? What is this? It's a pretty unique name. There's a forest named after this person. And if you dig a little deeper and you realize that this is the man who was the first head of the Forest Service, you think, there's a little more story there. Why did they name this forest after him? What was it like when he started the Forest Service? Why? It's a big, complex history. And so I'd been wanting to learn more about Gifford the man. And so when Rand applied to speak, and he said, I want to use some of the story of Gifford Pinchot the man and some of the misconceptions, and also the forest to talk about how we have managed public forests nationwide, I thought, this is everything I could hope for. So tonight you're going to hear more about how the man and the forest and this country has worked to take on the Herculean task, when you really think about it, of managing millions of public forests. I mean, just stop and think about that. Think about the last time you were out in a forest, how huge and vast it was, and then take that across a country of different ecosystems, different communities, different economies. And what we're going to hear some tonight is what the learning curve looked like, from why did you decide to take on this task that seems so insurmountable, or at least a fool's errand, how it went, where it went poorly, or maybe it went well, and what the future looks like. So with that, help me welcome Rand Schenck to Sense of Place Season 16.
Recognize Sarah and the Mount Adams Institute. Really appreciate the invitation to be here. I also want to recognize a couple of people who helped me along the way. Jürgen Hess is in the audience here. He provided some of the photographs for the book, and his wife Susan, who was the executive director of the Columbia Insight, and charged one of her writers, Chuck Thompson, with interviewing me, and that led to the first review of my book, so I'm very appreciative of that. And I understand that Lynn Burdett may be here or watching online. And Lynn, I want to express my appreciation to you for being one of my many interviewees in doing the research for this book. And then lastly, the grandson of Gifford Pinchot III, provided some incredibly important insights to me about his grandfather. And he lives here in Hood River. So wherever you are, Gifford Pinchot III, thank you so much. I have one last question or something I want to ask you to respond to. Raise your hand if you are a current or past Forest Service employee. We have some, a few. Yes. Gifford Pinchot named it the U.S. Forest Service because he wanted an agency that was in service to the public. And the employees of the U.S. Forest Service are in service to the public and are providing us invaluable work. So thank you for that. In my book, I examine 100 years of forestry history through the lens of what happened on this forest just across the river, the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And what happened on that forest is highly representative of what happened in every national forest in the Pacific Northwest. I dedicated the book to my daughters. I have two of those. I describe three distinct phases that the forest has passed through over the past 100 years. We had about a 40-year period of stewardship in which very few logs came off the national forest. We had a period of 45 years or so where an extraordinary amount of timber came off the national forest. I call that the high production phase. And then the past 30 years, we've been in the ecological management phase. Three very distinctive phases. And I look at and try to explore, why did we go through these very different approaches to how the forest was managed. So I was able to get 100 years of logging history, going as far back as 1920 up to 2020. So you see here 100 years. This is the history of the Gifford Pinchot National Forest logging. So on the vertical scale, millions of board feet, time scale on the horizontal scale, and there you can see the three very distinct phases. Roughly 20 million board feet a year during that stewardship phase, averaging about 450 million board feet during the high production phase. And then in this ecological management phase for the past 30 years, kind of back to the future, averaging somewhere close to 30 million board feet. And again, this is just the Gifford Pinchot logging on that forest, but it is highly representative of what happened on all the national forests in the Pacific Northwest. So I began my book with 5 simple words: a cabin in the woods. I just came from this cabin today. I've been up there the past few days. It sits next to Trapper Creek. I own this cabin. I do not own the land it sits on. I have a very big backyard, though. It's 1.3 million acres. You are also part owners of that forest. I had long had a dream of having a cabin in the woods. And I began that search in January of 2000. I decided it's finally time, the year 2000, I'm going to begin my search. And I pulled out the Oregonian, and that's what we did in those days. Looked at the newspaper, classified ads, and there was a little ad, literally cabin in the woods. I called the number. We met the next day, Monday. We met again on Wednesday. I wrote a check, and 3 days later, I was the owner of this cabin. And I feel like it was truly fated that I would find this place, really my dream. It sits next to Trapper Creek, and just on the other side of the questions, one of the things I learned early on was this cabin sits in one of the best preserved, low elevation, old growth groves in the entire Pacific Northwest. And I asked that question, well, why is it that so much of the old growth has been logged? Why not this particular drainage? Easy to access. And that's where the Forest Service went into initially during the beginning of that high production phases, these low elevation groves. Why wasn't this one logged? Well, the simple answer is water. This hotel, built next to Trapper Creek, in the early 1900s, people came up initially in their horse-drawn wagons, later in their Model Ts. They probably didn't come up to hike in the woods. They came up for the mineral water. These waters were felt to have life-giving, health-giving qualities. So people came up for the waters. And then beginning in the 20s, my cabin, along with others, were built up and down Trapper Creek. And so the simple answer on why this grove, the Trapper Creek drainage, was never logged was because of these mineral waters. Hence the name, the Government Mineral Springs. So just across the river, it's 1.3 million acres. It's bounded by Mount Adams on the east, Mount Rainier to the north, Mount St. Helens to the west, and of course the Columbia River along the southern border. So one of the questions I really had 2 distinct aims in writing this book. One was to tell the story of old growth. What happened to old growth? Why was most of it logged over this period of time? But the other was to ask, I was really curious about this man that Sarah talked about, Gifford Pinchot, who the forest was named after. What did he really care about? And a key question I had in mind was, if he were alive today and looking back over the last 100 years, how would he have felt about what happened on his namesake forest over that period of time? And so I began to really dive into exploring that question. And so this is the classic picture of Pinchot. He was the first chief of the Forest Service beginning in 1905, working with Teddy Roosevelt. And as a lifelong environmentalist, I always held up John Muir as my hero. And if I gave really any thought at all to Gifford Pinchot, it was really around, probably he's just somebody interested in getting the cutout, because that's kind of some of the impressions I had of the Forest Service at the time. And as I began to really dig into and better understand who he was as one of the originators of the conservation movement, I came to some very different conclusions about Pinchot. So I want to give you some of the things that he wrote, some of the things that he said. And again, as one of the originators of the conservation movement, he wrote that conservation is the most effective weapon against the monopoly of natural resources, and monopoly of resources is the basis for concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. In a democracy, that is the fundamental evil. He was responding to the Gilded Age of the 1890s and the early 1900s. You had the Carnegies, you had the Fisk, you had the Vanderbilts, all controlling monopolies of various resources, railroads. And so he was very much responding to that time. Yet it's incredibly, given the amount and accumulation of wealth in hands of a few, this statement is as relevant today as it was back then. He later wrote this, that conservation is the foresighted utilization, preservation, and or renewal of forests, lands, minerals for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the longest time. Now that last phrase, for the greatest good, for the longest time, greatest number, that was the founding mission of the Forest Service in 1905. He wrote this much later. And when he put that in his initial focus, primary reason for that, the driver for that was, at that time, the emphasis on the wood products coming from the forest, on water coming from the forest that we all needed. Later in life, he put much greater emphasis on preservation and or renewal, because that was in his heart, truly in his heart. One other quote that I'll give you, that this foundational belief that a utilitarian approach to forestry depended on the oversight and control by an imperishable guardian, the national government. Pinchot had observed forestry first as it happened on the East Coast. It was cut and run forestry, no replanting, landscapes decimated. Then the industry moved to the Midwest. Again, cut and run forestry, rural communities devastated as they kept moving west. And he saw where that industry was poised to go into our part of the world, the Pacific Northwest. And he felt strongly that the only way we could ensure a long-term sustainable approach to forestry was for the government to own and control those resources. And thank goodness for that. So the stewardship phase, again and I was only able to get the data back to 1920, so we can probably assume very little, those first 10 years they were setting up the agency, very few logs were coming off the forest at that time. But there were some really important insights that early researchers came to some conclusions. One of those was that our primary tree that foresters have always been interested in the Northwest is the Doug fir, and that Doug firs are shade intolerant. And so the Forest Service early on adopted the view that we should clear cut those Doug firs, because that would provide. Doug firs grow most rapidly during the first century, the first 100 years. So a logging rotation of 90 to 100 years was agreed to. But I wanted to then explore, again, they wanted to get logs off the forest. Why were more logs not coming off the Gifford Pinchot and other forests here in the Pacific Northwest? And there were really three primary reasons for that. One was that the private timber industry had a tremendous amount of private land, millions of acres, and most of that was old growth. And the private timber industry did not want competition. And the Forest Service was willing to go along with that. The second reason, and the reason they primarily were willing to go along with that, was they had this mistaken notion that a timber famine was just around the corner. And part of the reason for that was, if you think about timber and its importance throughout the 1800s as the primary resource for buildings and development, infrastructure, but by the 1900s we started to see much greater reliance on steel and concrete. But the Forest Service still had this notion that, oh, we're going to run out of timber. Great Depression came along, and demand just dropped. So we had those three forces working together that led to this reality that for 30, 40 years, the Forest Service acted as stewards of our forests here in the Northwest. So one of the early researchers, Thomas Munger, Stabler, that was where he was doing a lot of his work, just north of Carson, Washington. He said this about old growth: there is little satisfaction in working with a decadent old growth forest that is past redemption and calls for nothing but removal. Think about that. This became the dominant mindset of the Forest Service for, it's really a kind of a biblical view that is past redemption. The actual dictionary definition of decadence is fallen from grace. And so it would be sinful to leave these big trees on the landscape. And that really was the mindset that became adopted by foresters during the high production phase. So what are we talking about when we are talking about old growth? Jerry Franklin, who has been my mentor and is one of the old growth gurus, was really did some of the seminal research on old growth, and he identified 4 primary characteristics. And one is obvious here: big, live, standing trees. They just are. We have some groves like this size tree still in the southern part of the Gifford Pinchot. The second is dead standing trees that are slowly decaying, snags, that provide really critical habitat to a variety of species. The third definition is dead trees on the forest floor. And so you think about the life and death and rebirth of a forest. A Doug fir can grow for 800 years or more. It can continue as a dead snag for several hundred years. It can be another couple hundred years until it slowly decays into the forest floor. And the fourth characteristic of old growth forest is that you have lots of woody debris in streams. Well, so this is what this tree is what was considered decadent. So this is what the Forest Service said: we need to remove these trees from the forest. And the result was one log logging trucks taking these trees off the forest one at a time. I learned in my research that probably it was in the teens or 20s, the southern part of the Gifford Pinchot had the tallest, what probably was the tallest tree in the world. A Doug fir measured at 387 feet. If you were to lay that tree down in a football field, a 100-yard football field, you would still need an additional 30 yards to contain that tree. That's how tall it was. It would take 4 times this many logging trucks to haul that one tree off the landscape. And so not only did we have logging trucks, but we had logging trains. We don't see those now, but we had logging trains taking those big trees to the mill. Going back to this, when you see a logging truck today, how many logs, right? 30, something like that. So that's what we've transitioned from these to logging trucks with 30 to 50 trees on them. So you can see in this high production phase, you don't go from 30 million board feet a year coming off the forest to 600 million board feet a year overnight. It takes years to get there. And so we had this slow period of increasing the amount of people, the infrastructure, the mills. That took considerable time to bring into being. So one of the things that we saw was beginning in the 40s, we saw much more attention starting to be paid to economics as opposed to the ecology. And one of the interesting practices that Pinchot put in place beginning early on was requiring every national forest to go through an annual inspection and for that report to be written up. And those were invaluable resources for me as I did my research. And it was a tool he used for ensuring that his agency was transparent and was going to be accountable to the public, so that the agency was being held to account. And these were reports that were written up. And in 1947, we began to see some greater attention to economics. The author there wrote the Columbia, and the GP, before it was the GP, it was the Columbia National Forest, that its timber, water, recreation, and other values can contribute much to local, regional, and national wealth. And I want to read just a short piece from that annual inspection report. So the general inspection reports for the Columbia National Forest had been generated by outside auditors for nearly 40 years. This was one of the first to connect the Columbia National Forest with the wealth of the country. We can see here the shift that was occurring within the Forest Service, from valuing conservation as the first priority to valuing production and economic development as the first priority. Mays makes this transformation clear in its next paragraph, quote, "The job of managing the Columbia National Forest is rapidly changing from protection of an inaccessible virgin backwoods to the intensive management of forest lands adjacent to a heavily populated industrial zone," end quote. And I go on to say, rarely does one encounter such an explicit description in the transformation of the culture of a federal agency. Two key phrases are distinctive: inaccessible virgin backwoods and intensive management. The first phrase was the on-the-ground reality that had existed not only for the first 40 years, but since time immemorial. The second phrase, intensive management, was not an on-the-ground reality, but rather an aspiration, if not a measurable objective. One reflected the past, the other the future. It was almost as if the Forest Service could not begin to go into this high production phase as long as Pinchot was around. He died in 1946. And so it was as if that once he was gone, once he was no longer around, the Forest Service could now really begin to do the kind of logging it was prepared to do. And we saw in 1948, that was when Truman signed legislation renaming the Columbia National Forest as the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And this is the Gifford Pinchot III. This is his grandson. And he told me stories about sitting on Truman's knee during this time when he renamed it the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. And soon after that, there was a renaming ceremony at the La Wiswis campground just on the north side of Mount Adams. And that's Pinchot's widow, Cornelius Pinchot. And she said this at the renaming ceremony, that, quote, "Pinchot insisted that conservation be reinvigorated, revived, remanned, revitalized by each successive generation. Its implications, urgencies, its logistics translated in terms of the present of each of them." Pinchot was a lifelong learner. He grew and developed over time, changed his opinions of what was the right thing to do. And I have no doubt that if Pinchot were alive now, one of the great urgencies he would be responding to would be the climate crisis and the fact that our forests here are some of the most effective tools in the world for drawing down and sequestering and storing carbon. So I want to look at a report that was written in the 1950, and these are pictures of Goat Lake and Goat Rocks in the Goat Rocks wilderness. And you know, the person writing this annual inspection report, you know, again, part of the report was to give statistics, all right, what was happening on the forest with respect to timber production and other matters. But this particular report really illustrates the reverence that these Forest Service leaders had for Pinchot, some 45 years after he was the head of the agency. Again, this is directly from that report. I was amazed that a country so primitive and spectacular could be found so near to the byways of men. I fervently hope this area can always be kept as wilderness. Gradually, some of the details of the vast expanse of mountainous terrain came to my awareness. Between me and majestic Mount Adams and Mount St. Helens was the solid green of forest, broken only by old burns and the rocky barrenness of the Twin Sisters Mountains. I know that beyond the horizon of the hazy faraway hills, the forest stretched on to the banks of the Columbia, to the cutover lands that fringed the forest to the west. Within that space was 1.3 million acres of national forest land. And I thought of the 190 million board feet of timber that can be harvested annually by us and our progeny. And he goes on to give some data, because that was the purpose. It was to talk about the data. But then he went on to say, northwest of me, a mist hung over the valley of the Cowlitz River. Somewhere down there was the La Whis campground. Many, no doubt, would be looking at the plaque embedded in the granite stone besides two giant Doug firs, informing them and generations to follow that this great forest is named for and dedicated to the memory of a great man, Gifford Pinchot. I thought of the leadership and inspiration he gave to conservation in our nation and felt some of those who selected this forest to bear his name. Past and present were linked for a moment, and I couldn't help but feel that in these men and their associates throughout the forest is the same zeal that stirred Gifford Pinchot. I thought then, as I do now, that the general inspection is completed and the work on the forest is, as well as its resources, are worthy of the name it bears. End quote. That was all from Standing. I go on to write, Standing represents the old guard looking back, unwilling yet to acknowledge the transition that was already underway. He was the rare romantic who was being eclipsed by the hard-edged realist. So the part I read coming from, that was a government report. How many government reports have you read that were as poetic as that one was? Really quite extraordinary, but it just so represents the care he had for the land, for the forest, and for the man. So in the 50s, we saw the emergence of what came to be called the Iron Triangle. This congruence and alignment between the executive branch overseeing the Forest Service under the Department of Ag, the Congress, the legislative branch, and the forest industry, all aligned on getting the cut up and out. For sure on the congressional branch, this was money coming into rural communities. This was revenue that was going to be very helpful, and there was a lot of it. And so this really it pretty much ensured that there was no debate whatsoever. We're going to get the cut it up and out. We're going to get those decadent forests off the landscape. And so just the chief aim of the Forest Service in the 50s, going back, was to transform our natural forest into single species, single aged timber plantations. That was the chief aim. There was very little understanding of ecology at that time, but the result was this. These vast clear cuts across the landscape, and all of the pictures you see in this slideshow are from the Gifford Pinchot, except for one, and I'll point that out. But the result of targeting the liquidation of the old growth resulted in these vast sets of landscapes across the land. This clear cutting reached its apotheosis in the 60s in Montana. And this is a picture of what happened there. This was from the Bitterroots. And the Forest Service decided that it could be most efficient and productive if it took bulldozers and created terraces, just leveled the sides of the mountains and created these terraces so that they could grow timber as if it were a corn crop. And you know, old loggers looked at this and were aghast. Fortunately, this did generate a lot of negative press, a lot of negative attention, and the Forest Service said, whoa, I guess maybe this isn't such a good idea. In my research, I found a picture in one of the reports that the Gifford Pinchot National Forest supervisor generated around this time, and that person has a picture of a terrace in the Gifford Pinchot, of a whole mountainside terrace. It was done in the old Yakult burn, and it didn't get any attention. And it's one of the reasons why the Gifford Pinchot National Forest has been known by two nicknames: the sacrificial forest and the forgotten forest. And because it's a place where they could do these extreme practices knowing that they were going to get very little attention. A place where they could go in and do all kinds of intensive management, again, knowing that they were not going to get much attention. In 1965, this is what the Forest Service chief had to say, that when we harvest over-mature, defective timber that would otherwise be wasted, there is bound to be a temporary loss of natural beauty. But there is the promise of what is to come, a thrifty new forest replacing the old. The point is that there often must be a drastic, even violent upheaval to create a new forest. That was the dominant mindset. We've got to liquidate the old growth to allow this vigorous, fast, well-regulated forest take its place. And so just as we saw in the 60s, urban renewal decimate mostly urban black communities, our natural forests also experience their own kind of violence. The seeds for change, though, came out of this period. Critical environmental legislation was passed beginning in the late 60s and early 70s under a Republican administration. We saw the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA. We saw the the Endangered Species Act, the ESA, and we saw the National Forest Management Act. All those came out of this period by the early 70s. This was critical legislation that ultimately led to lots of change. It took some time for that change to occur, but it did plant the seeds for that change. And there were two changes that were really critical to that. One was the requirement that each national forest develop these plans for what they intended to do in the future. And it required public participation. For the first time, the public had a seat at the table. They could comment on these plans, suggest this or that. So we, the public, for the first time, had an opportunity to influence those plans. The other change was to develop these plans, the Forest Service had to go out and hire ologists. That was the term. Ecologists, biologists, hydrologists, archaeologists, the specialists who they needed to develop these plans. And along with that, we saw a significant increase in the hiring of diverse peoples, people of color, more women, a lot more diversity coming in to the national forest. And that would have impact some time down the road. So I want to read a short piece from one of the people I interviewed. One moment. I'm losing my place here. me. Okay, I think I apologize. I'm having trouble finding that, but I'll just skip it. I interviewed the Forest Service supervisor named Bob Williams, and he was in charge of the Gifford Pinchot in the 80s. And I sort of expected that he would express some regrets over this targeting of the old growth, but he didn't. And he talked with some pride about having targeted old growth, having the difficulty that he had getting into the more difficult places to reach where old growth was, and talked about the intensive management of old growth and what that required. But it was something that was very surprising to me that he didn't even 30 years later express any regrets. So you all recognize this. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted, and we all probably have seen the pictures of what that resulted in. Thousands of acres of logs, of trees just flattened on the landscape, all kind of from south to north. And what did the Forest Service wanted to do? It wanted to engage in the largest salvage operation ever contemplated. But fortunately, the environmental community had a stronger voice. The ologists that I was speaking to had a stronger voice, and they said, no, this is an incredible research opportunity. We need to see how this area is going to restore itself over time. Let it just happen naturally. And as a result of that, the Mount St. Helens National Monument was created, and it was preserved. And there was some really important research that was conducted and that led to some important understandings, and I will just read about that. The reality on the ground was that those areas that were left undisturbed in the chaotic conditions left by the blast were in fact the quickest to recover. Where salvage logging did occur, biological diversity was reduced. However, where the natural decay process was allowed to unfold, the soil more quickly gained needed nutrients. Seeds were more readily able to take root, and as a result, plants and animals began to flourish in an astonishingly short time. Several species that had previously not lived in the area, such as western meadowlarks, found a home there. Ecologists began to speak not of the recovery of the mountain, but rather the renewal of Mount St. Helens. Jerry Franklin, the preeminent old-growth guru, was one of the researchers who experienced an epiphany after the Mount St. Helens eruption. A new term came into play, biological legacy, that would reshape how many came to understand the role of catastrophic disturbances in shaping landscapes, not only in the GP, but across the Pacific Northwest. Scientists were truly stunned by how quickly life returned to the seemingly sterile, bleak landscape post-eruption. Rather than an inhospitable environment, a biological legacy ensued in which a wide variety of living organisms, spores, seeds, and fungi, and plants and animals emerged. And one of the most important requirements for this emergence was leaving the landscape undisturbed. Dead trees and snags and down logs were left alone, which provided just the habitat needed to propagate new life. So really important in this case to just leave things alone. And then a little bird came along. We've heard this. We all know what this bird is, the northern spotted owl. Beautiful bird. In 1991, Judge William Dwyer up in Seattle issued an injunction that brought all logging in spotted owl habitat, some 22 million acres, to a screeching halt. And that shocked the Forest Service, that shocked congresspeople, that shocked the timber industry. Essentially, the judge said to the representing the judicial branch of our government, said to the executive branch, you are breaking the law and that has to stop. And it was a pretty earth-shaking moment for folks here in the Northwest. I didn't move here until '96 from North Carolina, but I remember reading about that. And one of the results was the timber wars became part of the presidential race in 1992. And early in, well, so it's not, this is not advancing right now. You know, there we go.
Is that what you want?
Yep, that's what I want. So that led in 1993. Early in his administration, Clinton convened a meeting of all the stakeholders, obviously members of the Forest Service, the environmental community, the timber industry, all came together in Portland for two full days. This was a huge commitment, a huge investment on his part, and essentially saying, we've got to do something about this. And a lot of testimony, a lot of people spoke. The result of this was he charged Jerry Franklin, who he had come to respect, with developing a plan. And Jerry Franklin, along with a few of his peers, were really the primary architects of the Northwest Forest Plan. And that was approved by the administration as the guidance for how we're going to do forestry moving forward in the future. And that led to some really, really significant changes. The primary result of that in terms of its impact on forestry was a 75% decrease in the amount of logs coming off the national forest in order to protect habitat for these endangered species. And the reality was that many rural communities did suffer, and many had a real difficult time coming back. Some changed their focus, began to focus on recreation, Hood River, and have done quite well. Just one last reading. I want to read, these scientists were charged with writing an assessment and called an ecological, economic, and social assessment. So these are Forest Service personnel, employees, who were charged with writing this. And this is what they wrote. I'll get to that in a second, but the most damning assertions in the FEMAT report identified multiple failures on the part of the agency that had failed to live up to Gifford Pinchot's vision of the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. The report pointedly listed the many reasons for the crisis that resulted in judicial intervention. So this next piece comes directly from the report. Quote, "It is caused by not practicing multiple use management, wherein all of the resources are valued and managed on a sustained yield basis. It is caused by not providing an adequate rationale for liquidation of old growth trees, when the allowable cut effect was discredited as silviculturally impossible. It is caused by not embracing a vision of the federal forest as repositories of diverse resource values, but rather holding a narrow definition of the value of forest as commercial timberlands. It is caused by ignoring the comments of people around the country on forest plans, wilderness designations, wild and scenic river designations," end quote. And I go on to say, the writers were emphatically and vigorously castigating the old culture, the dominant leaders of the previous 45 years, for their many failures. Pinchot's heirs in his namesake forest and across the Pacific Northwest were finally being held to account. They failed the forest, they failed Pinchot, they failed the public they served. So really quite an extraordinary indictment coming from those within the Forest Service itself. So for the past 30 years, we've been in this phase of ecological management. And there are several ways to describe what this phase looks like. You can apply a very coarse filter of ecosystem management that looks across multiple landscapes, a very high-level view, and you can apply a very fine filter of biodiversity conservation where you're looking at things very closely about what's happening on the ground. So a 50,000 point view, multiple landscapes, as well as using tools like survey and manage to know what's happening close to the ground so we can ensure that species will not be endangered in the future. And that really is a very brief summary of the kind of forestry that's being guided and being practiced today. Now we have some changes that we're facing over the past 11 months. But one of the things that if we look at going back to where we are in terms of harvest levels, you can see, in the teens it went up to 50, almost 50 million board feet, but it's probably been averaging roughly 30 million board feet a year for the past 30 years. And so even though there may be desire to rapidly increase, it takes time to bring in the people, to bring in the resources, to bring in the mills, to bring in the logging trucks. It just doesn't happen overnight to go from 50 million to 100 million board feet. So, and the other aspect that really has changed here has been the Forest Service culture. So all of that diversity that came in beginning in the 70s and 80s of people coming in, those folks have been moving into leadership roles. I think Aaron Black may be here. And is Aaron here? Or is watching? But who's the district ranger of the Mount Adams district. But we saw a culture change, and that has. I have real trust and faith in the Forest Service about doing the right thing in the future. Probably, again, one of the most significant changes we've seen is that our national forests here in the Pacific Northwest have gone from being a carbon source, emitting tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere, contributing to the climate crisis, to being a really important carbon sink, drawing down, sequestering, and storing carbon, because our forests in the Pacific Northwest are among the most carbon dense in the entire world. They have an important role to play. And so as a way of kind of bringing this to a conclusion, these natural forests, they're messy, they're complex, they can't be well regulated. And my hope for the future is that I have a new granddaughter who's about 11 months old now, but I even think about my grandchildren's children, my great-grandchildren. My hope is that they will begin to see the kind of forest that my grandfather would have seen or have experienced had he walked through the Cascades in the early 1900s. And that is my hope for the future. Thank you very much.
Okay, this is your chance. What questions didn't get answered, or what questions came up by what he said? Do you mind passing that back to the person behind you? Thank you.
I hate using these. Can you hear me?
It's so the people at home can hear you, so
no,
just
I'm sorry.
bear with it.
So I would ask, what would Gifford Pinchot think today of the continued logging in the Gifford Pinchot forests, speaking specifically to the Gotchen timber sale that happened and is about to launch, literally logging trucks rolling here any minute, 900 acres of mature forest in the Gifford Pinchot. I think your presentation is fantastic, thank you. I think it makes it sound like the logging of that time is done, but it's not over, and it's literally on the doorstep of 900 acres of mature forest that probably would have looked just like the stuff that isn't logged. So my question
You know,
is, what would he be thinking? Would he be rolling over in his grave, or that's the way to manage the forest?
First and foremost, Pinchot had a very strong utilitarian philosophy. He believed in use. The most important book he wrote for the Forest Service was called the Use Book. And he recognized that forest products were important to the economy. And I'm not going to get into the details of that particular sale, but with let's say on average 30 million board feet a year coming off the forest, he would be saying, yeah, that is a sustainable level of forestry. He was a scientist. He was someone who believed in research and paying attention to the best available science. So I have no doubt that he would seek out people who had better knowledge of particular practices if he were asked that specific question. But he was a believer in providing wood products to the public. And I think something I didn't mention, in the high production phase, one of the changes was after World War II, you had the GIs all coming home. What did they want to do? They wanted their homes to be built so they could raise families. So we obviously have an ongoing need for wood products. Can we do that in a sustainable way? And that would be his key question. Can we log in a way that is sustainable and ecologically appropriate?
Okay. Yes, sir. Thanks for making me not have to walk too far. I appreciate it.
Your graph of the million board feet kind of followed those phases pretty closely. I'm curious, what does that look like on private lands over that same period? I know we're pretty low now, but is that the case on like the Weyerhaeusers and the like?
So, essentially all the old growth was logged on private industrial lands. There's essentially none left now. Very little on, and there's maybe on public lands somewhere around 8%. Public lands in the Pacific Northwest, we have maybe 8% of those lands that have old growth on it. So from the GP actually had about 70% in 1900 because a lot of it had burned previously. Other forests had up to 90% old growth, but today it's less than 8% roughly in the Pacific Northwest on public lands. There's none. There's none on these on private lands. But one of the things that's changed on private lands is that they had early on, prior to the Northwest Forest Plan, a much longer logging rotation, 75 to 80 years. The current logging rotation on almost all private industrial forest lands here in the Pacific Northwest is 35 to 40 years. If you were to double that and go from 40 to 80 years, not only do you get more than double the timber volume, you get more than double the carbon sequestered and stored in those in that wood. So it's a real win-win-win. So the private timber industry are on this very, very short-term cycle. So they have, in many ways, stepped into the gap of fulfilling and responding to the demand for wood products. Because so much less has been coming off our woods. The other thing to recognize this is nationally, where is a lot of the wood coming off our national forest is off the southeast, is in the southeast. Very productive forests there in the southeast. So a huge amount of volumes there.
What kind of wood do they have down there?
Pines, all pine.
Yeah, Rand, thanks so much for that presentation. Brought back a lot of memories for me working with spotted owls back in the 80s and 90s. I was kind of curious in your discussions with Jerry Franklin for your research, if you had a chance to talk with him about how his views about forest practices have evolved. You mentioned, incorporating natural disturbance and species diversity. A lot of those principles been integrated into how federal forest lands are managed or will be managed in the future. Do you have a sense for that?
I do, and I have the good fortune that Jerry also has one of the cabins up at the Trapper Creek, so he's a neighbor when he gets up there. Jerry has been highly influential in terms of these practices. I talked about biodiversity conservation, the survey and manage, how critical that is to know what's happening on the ground, and to look at forests across multiple landscapes, how important that is, again, to look at the whole, to look at the pieces as well. You know, if I were to put myself into Jerry Franklin's shoes and say, Jerry, do you approve of everything the Forest Service is doing now? He would say no. I know that. He can be a bit of a curmudgeon at times. And he has really real clarity around what the shoulds are. And it'd be hard for any forester actually to live up to that. But have they generally, I think, adopted his ecological management approach to forestry? Generally, yes. I think he would feel comfortable in saying he's much more comfortable with how the Northwest Forest Plan has been implemented, because that was his plan, pretty much his plan, about how that has been implemented over the past 30 years. I think he would be comfortable with that.
Okay, one or two more. If you guys have them, don't be scared. Oh, thank you. Oh boy, here we go. Hi, Mr. Hess.
Sarah, here we go. Rand, thank you so much for that. It was an excellent presentation. I've read and reread your book. I want to give folks a little insight from somebody who was on the inside during that cut and run phase. I would come home, crying, and think, what the hell am I doing here? What am I doing here? I should join the Sierra Club, Park Service. And Susan said, hang in there. It'll change. You can help make the change. So what I started doing, I would go to those timber sales that had a blue slash mark for cutting. In my backpack, I would carry a can of black paint. And you know what I did? I marked them out.
A monkey wrencher.
So you mentioned Bent Hamner. He and I were some of those ologists. And we've come through that era. And Jerry Franklin's a good friend of mine, and we're so happy that things have really changed.
Thank you, Jervin. Unless someone's really got it going right now, Rand is going to be outside signing books. If we run out, Waukoma will have more books, so you can check in with them. I want to wrap things up, but you're stuck. You're going to have to keep talking to us out in the hallway, and you know that. I usually ask, as Rand knows, our speakers one final question. And one of the things we talked about, I don't know if any of you guys subscribe to Michelle Nijhuis's Substack. It sounds so nerdy and academic, you guys, I swear. Michelle Nijhuis is an author who happens to live here, but she recently wrote a story, and she said, I think it was titled, Is Environmentalism Out of Ideas? And the whole idea and she says this much more intelligently than I will, but the whole idea is the tactics or the way of communicating of the Rachel Carson Silent Spring version of look at what's going on, and using more of fear that came in some of the times that Rand talked about. Do we need to now evolve beyond that, or use different ways to effectively reach people? And what she said is, do we need to move from Silent Spring to more of a braiding sweetgrass way of welcoming people in and sharing the awe and excitement that is in nature, because otherwise people are overwhelmed, and they got big trees they got to take care of, they've got water they got to take care of, and they just sort of throw their hands up, and more than one environmentalist has said, people don't care. Or maybe they're just exhausted, who knows. So Rand and I talked about this a little bit, and you can take it one of the two ways that we talked about, which was you grew up in a place where you loved trees and were outdoors, so much so that you specifically picked Oregon based on our land use history. You knew you wanted a cabin in the Gifford Pinchot because you loved these trees. You came here, you appreciate them. You've had that awe from the get-go. Most people will never see an old growth tree or never walk in a forest like we have here. And yet, if we're asking them to be stewards, how can we get them on board, especially knowing how many people are vying for their attention and telling them the sky is falling? So you and I talked about maybe you sharing one of your instances of awe for those who may never connect in the way that you have. So think on it, take it the direction you want. You know, because we talked in the green room about it, but hold on one sec. This is your chance to think about it. And then come up with something really amazing to send us into the end of the year and the end of the night. While Rand thinks, I want to quickly tell you guys about next month. It's going to be a little break here, you guys, so just don't forget. If you get the newsletter, which hopefully you do, January 21st, Dylan Head Nicely was featured in the Tribal Fishing podcast that we did for Here in the Gorge. He helped give that historical context to why the hell we talk about salmon in the Northwest. Have you guys ever left the Northwest and talked about salmon and people going, why are you talking about this fish so much? So Dylan has a really unique perspective. He runs the Native Law Center at University of Idaho. He is a member of Cherokee Nation, but works a lot with the 4 treaty tribes here in the Northwest. So he has sort of an insider-outsider perspective on the history of salmon in our region that I think is really important for us all to know. And then we can explain to our friends and family outside of the Northwest why we talk about salmon so much. We also have another event in January. This is a special event called the Volcano Listening Project. If anyone saw the Watershed Rock Opera, you know if we can use music to tell stories and get nerdy, I'm on board. We have one of our nerdy piano player right here, Tim Mayer, who is also a hydrologist. For the Volcano Listening Project, we have an internationally recognized ensemble of musicians, of which I can take no responsibility other than I said yes when they said, what do you think about us coming and playing music along with sonified data of volcanoes erupting, and then also talking about volcano science. And I was like, this sounds great, as I'm sure you guys all will. One of the musicians is a Grammy and Tony Award winner. And he helped, I think, co-compose Hadestown on Broadway. So that's next month. January 29th, we have 2 shows, one at 5-something and one at 7-something. So look on the website. Get tickets now. Don't wait, because then I feel bad if you don't get tickets. Quick announcement for anyone who was at the first event. You know Jeannie Carver, the sheep rancher? We can say it now. Ralph Lauren has announced that Shanico wool from right here will be used in the Olympic uniforms for the next Olympics in Italy. So, this is Ralph Lauren, you guys. I can't tell you how great it is to see all these fancy other partners and then to see Mop in Oregon, Shanico wool. Versions of those upcoming like walk-in, walk-out sweaters and the uniforms are right now in the mail to the Discovery Center, and they will be putting them into their permanent exhibit there so you can go see what they look like before anyone else does. So stay tuned. They told me at the museum they think they will have them up next week. So yeah, big news. Okay. Sorry guys, we got a lot of notes here tonight. Okay. I want to thank our volunteers. We rely on volunteers to do a lot of the work out front, which is really hard, and I appreciate that. Thank Cole and CCA for having us in this lovely center. Each month, they've got a play coming up, Junie B this weekend, if you're around. Thank Alex, who always has great technical ideas and problem solving. Our sponsors who you saw before, I want to thank Kyle, our photo ninja. I mean, I feel like as a tree, this is kind of obvious, but we gotta go with it. Yeah, so ready? I can't hold this, I'm in heels. Do it fast. Oh. Okay, that's all I got. I hope you got it. Kyle takes all our photos and we love him. The last thing I want to do is, if you are a Forest Service person, past, present, please stand up. And don't roll your eyes at me, and I know who you are, so stand up. Aaron? Yes. Okay. I will be honest, when Rand applied, one of my concerns was that I didn't want to just have this be yet one more shit on the Forest Service. Because when you're the big dog, it's easy to have a lot of people point fingers. And I know for you Forest Service people, as we saw with Jurgen, but also this past year has been a hard year. And I want to tell you from the bottom of my heart how much you've taught me. Thank you. Oh, I hate that I cry, but I hope you guys know, as hard as this year has been, as hard as it has been in the past, I'm trying to be a conduit for the deep knowledge you guys have for this place and share it with others. So thank you so much. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Thanks, Rand. Something amazing, no pressure.
I'll just speak to two primal emotions that really drive action. And one is love and one is fear. And I had the good fortune growing up to spend a lot of time in the Blue Ridge Mountains. My grandfather had a vacation home up there. And the view from the porch was of the tallest mountain ridge east of the Rockies. The tallest mountain in the States, Mount Mitch, and east of the Rockies was Mount Mitchell, and it's called the Black Mountain Ridge, Tocillo's Knob. And I spent lots and lots of time just looking at all hours at this landscape. And it was 40 miles from where we were to this ridge, which is a long distance in that part of the world to be able to see. And that just really instilled into me love. And there was one point in which I pulled out a map, and I always wondered, why aren't there any lights out there? I'm seeing 40 miles, and I'm not seeing any lights in this whole view shed. And I finally pulled out the map, and it's the Pisgah National Forest. I'm right at the boundary of the Pisgah National Forest, and we need to protect that forevermore. And so that just generated love for me. And the other is fear. And I go back to join the Sierra Club in the late 70s, and somebody came along in 1981 named James Watt. And if you remember, those of us who are a little older remember that. And that was the fear of, what did he want to do? He wanted to sell off all the public land. And that generated a lot of activity. So these emotions, love and fear, can both drive us to do things that we might not think we're capable of. Thank you.
Thank you, Rand. Next month. Thanks so much. That was great.